Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. Stay awake and be ready, for you do not know on what day your Lord will come. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus told his disciples this parable. The kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones, when taking their lamps, brought no oil with them, but the wise brought flasks of oil with their lamps. Since the bridegroom was long delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight there was a cry, "Behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those virgins got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise ones replied, "No, for there may not be enough for us and you. Go instead to the merchants and buy some for yourselves." While they went off to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went into the wedding feast with him. Then the door was locked. Afterwards, the other virgins came and said, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he said in reply, "Amen, I say to you, I do not know you. Therefore stay awake, for you know neither the day nor the hour." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In today's Gospel, Christ gives us this great parable, the wise and the foolish virgins. And there's just so much that could be said about it. It's difficult to know where exactly to begin, but we have at the end a kind of a judgment that these foolish virgins don't have enough oil. They run out of oil. They didn't prepare for the end, and so they're excluded. They come late because they had to go out and buy oil, and they knock on the door and they get a response. They say, "I do not know you." The person inside, the bridegroom, who represents, of course, Christ, says that he doesn't know who they are, and on that basis they're excluded. And that's a warning to us that we have to prepare for an encounter with God that will come at the end of our lives, that we have to be ready for his judgment. And that judgment will be a simple reckoning. And we'll have to give an account of ourselves, how we used our time, how we used our talents, how we devoted ourselves to the building up of God's kingdom. This is what will be expected of us at our judgment, and we have to take that seriously. But when it comes to the parables, they often end with a terrible judgment. They often end with a dire warning regarding what might happen to us. We hear of people being cast out into the outer darkness, where there's wailing and grinding of teeth. Or someone, and in fact, I feel like just recently or at least a few weeks ago, we read the parable of the wedding banquet, where a guy is bound hand and foot. He's reduced to silence, and then bound hand and foot and cast into the outer darkness, where there's wailing and grinding of teeth. And then there's others where someone says you will be handed over. There's a warning: you will be handed over to the torturers, and presumably there will be wailing and grinding of teeth there too. But I remember hearing a joke from a scripture professor of mine at Duquesne, and he was Irish. So every joke he told was about 10% funnier because of his Irish accent. But he said that there was a congregation where there was a fire and brimstone preacher, and I guess he was Protestant. But he's giving a homily where he's giving a sermon where he's warning people about being cast into the outer darkness, where there'll be wailing and grinding of teeth. And it becomes a refrain all through his sermon. There will be wailing and grinding of teeth. And finally, a little old lady in the front row puts up her hand and says, "Well, what if you don't have any teeth?" And he leans into his teeth will be provided. And but in all of these instances, there's a there's a terrible foreboding in all of these indications regarding the judgment that awaits us and the possibility of us being rejected by God. But when you realize something surprising about all of these parables, it becomes there's something surprising kind of tucked away and hidden in plain sight, as it were, within these parables that suddenly gives us a lot of consolation, I think. And that is to say that Christ endured all of those judgments. If you think about all of those warnings, they all apply to Christ on Good Friday. He is cast into the outer darkness. He's crucified beyond the city walls of Jerusalem. He's cast out into the outer darkness. He is bound hand and foot. He's bound in chains. He is handed over to the torturers who flog him and scourge him and nail him to a cross. And then, and presumably, he cries out in agony. I don't know if you can exactly say there's wailing and grinding of teeth, but something like it occurs. That Jesus suffers all of these fates. That all of the fates reserved to the sinner are experienced by Christ first. And I think what's being said here is that the sinner, the one who experiences alienation and the degradation of sin, the one who experiences the consequences of sin, is always in close proximity to Christ. Christ is there with him. Christ is there first. And I think the message comes that we have to take the judgment of God with utmost seriousness, of course, but we also have to take with utmost seriousness the readiness of Christ to stand in solidarity with us as we experience the weight of sinfulness and the consequence of sinfulness. And the uplifting, I think, message comes as the whole picture is taken into account, that we can never, no matter how hard we try, we can never place ourselves beyond the reach of God's mercy, that he is always there ready to bless and forgive us. And I think one of the problems of sinfulness, one of the terrible consequences of sinfulness, is that we end up taking our sins a lot more seriously than God does. And that sounds strange. The reason why there are so many sinners seems to be because people like sin or don't take it seriously enough. But I think from within what inevitably happens to the sinner, the person's kind of trapped in vice, is that his or her own vices start to seem like insurmountable obstacles between the sinner and God. The sinner begins to say to him or herself, I've dug a hole so deep for myself, I cannot get out. And the sinner turns the molehills of his or her own sins into mountains that cannot be overcome, whereas God can just wipe them away with a stroke, with a wave of the hand, with his grace, with his mercy. God can pull the sinner back. And there are so many stories within the lives of the saints of terrible sinners who do dramatic about faces. A person like St. Augustine, St. Paul. There are just countless examples of this. We are never as far from mercy and virtue and goodness as we think. And we discourage ourselves. One of the names for Satan in the New Testament is the accuser. And all too often, that accusatorial spirit is exactly what we direct towards ourselves. We think, I'm not good enough, I've messed up too badly, there's no hope for me. And that's exactly what our enemy wants us to think. But Christ is our advocate. Christ is the one who tells us we can do it. And in fact, not only can we do it, but he will do the heavy lifting for us by his mercy, by his grace. So I think this is all of the parables ultimately. All of the parables are portions of the scriptures that have to be read in terms of the Passion story. The Passion story has always been regarded as the key. The Passion stories always occur at the end of the Gospels. But really, in terms of their significance, they're at the center of everything. Every other passage in the whole of the Bible has to be read in light of the Passion story. That's where the mercy of God is really placed before us. John Paul II makes this point, where he talks about the fact that within the course of the Passion story, the human story of sin, or the terrible injustice of Pontius Pilate, the depraved sensuality of King Herod, the murderous rage of the crowd, the cowardice and the duplicity of the disciples themselves, Christ's most intimate friends. All of these are made to serve as a kind of a black background against which we can finally perceive the light and the magnitude of God's love. And so it's in the light of that love that we have to read all the rest of the Bibles, but even the New Testament, even where Christ himself is speaking, even where his word is coming directly from the Lord himself. Even those words have to be read in light of the incomparably greater revelation that occurs in the course of Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection. But as regards, this parable, the story of the wise virgins, the great image is the lamp, and keeping the lamp burning, and keeping this flame alive. And when it comes to light and the burning of this fire, it calls us back to the reality of purity of heart. And these are, after all, virgins. And these would be something like the maids of honor and the bridesmaids of a wedding. And the main figure of this parable is the bridegroom. And so the theme of wedding, the theme of marriage comes up, and the status of these women as virgins kind of calls to mind the issues of sexual purity and of sexual morality. And the idea of keeping the lamps and burning and light in the New Testament were always interpreted as having a special association with sexual purity. That sexual purity has a special connection to being able to see, to being able to see what's going on around us, to be able to see the reality of other persons all the way down, not just the surface, being able to see down below the surface. This is sounded in the Beatitudes. Christ says, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." There's a special association between purity of heart, and being able to recognize God. And so Christ sounds that right from the beginning of his ministry, that is emphasized. And there's a wonderful example of this or something like it anyway. A great analogy is provided by a miracle that Christ presents to us in the Gospels. He finds a man who's blind, and he takes the man outside the city that he's found in, and he takes him out and heals him. He heals him of his blindness, but only about halfway. And then he's asked, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." And then he heals him again, and then he sees and then he sees clearly. And so there's he's healed, but by stages. And that report that he makes about seeing people, but they look like trees walking, it reminds me of something I heard when I was in college. There was I came across an economist named Thorstein Veblen, and he was a terrible critic of the abuses of capitalism. And he said that in capitalist societies, there's a division between what he called the substantial people, the important people, those who have rights, those who are valued, and then those whom he called two-legged beasts, people who are treated like animals, people who are used selfishly by the strong and these substantial people. And we might say that man is healed. In his partial healing, he sees people as two-legged beasts. He sees that they are people. He sees but they look like trees walking. He can't see the full extent of their humanity. And when Christ heals him all the way, suddenly he's brought fully to the ability to see them as they really are, as persons. His vision is restored. Well, we might say that Christ wants to effect within the vision of our hearts what he has effected with this man in his eyes. He wants us to be able to see other people really, to see their full humanity, to not see them selfishly, or as we often say, not to see them as mere objects. And this is the special gift, or we won't achieve this gift, we won't acquire this virtue until we confront honestly our need to see other people in purity of heart, to develop the purity of heart that is required by the virtue of chastity. And this is why I talk about this, because I think it's prominently displayed in this gospel. These virgins are supposed to keep their lamps trimmed, to keep them filled, to be vigilant, to be able to see, to be able to stand ready to receive the one who is their beloved. And this ability to see will require a sacrifice. It will require kind of the bodily mortification of being chaste. But this is where the life of discipleship will lead us. In order to love, in order to see people as they really are, we have to be chaste. Nowhere except in the realm of sexuality do we see what we want to see, or do we hear what we want to hear. To really see people as they really are requires this sacrifice. We might say further that these lamps and the oil that's in the lamps kind of connote the sacraments. When we're baptized, we are anointed with oil, and then again we are confirmed. And we might say that this practice of keeping the lamp trimmed, of keeping it ready to burn bright, is a matter of returning to the grace that we receive when we receive the sacraments. That is where the strength and the proximity to Christ will bless us and make us strong, make us able to make the sacrifice that's required in order to be virtuous, in order to be chaste and pure, in order to see people as they really are, rather than to have our vision continuously contaminated by our selfishness. Someone once said, I heard a spiritual writer, a theologian, say that going through life with, possessed of the 7 deadly sins, pride, envy, lust, gluttony, all of them, it's like going through life with dirty hands. Everything you touch is kind of contaminated and soiled. I have to believe, and that this is what so many experience. As they go through life, they can see the mistakes they've made. They can see the difficulties and the problems they've caused, but only in hindsight, only after the fact, only after relationships have become spoiled by selfishness and self-serving. Only after the damage is done can the problem be seen. Purity of heart, the ability to see people clearly, the ability to respond to the humanity of those around us in a real and proper way, rather than according to the distortions of our egotism and our narcissism. This requires virtue, and this requires a commitment to the gospel, a commitment to follow through on the graces that we receive through the sacraments. This is where the Lord wants to lead us. And we have the same vocation as the good virgins in this gospel, to keep our lamps trimmed by prayer, by the sacraments, to create for ourselves a reserve of virtue and grace, a solidarity with Christ that then gives us the blessing of a true and lasting solidarity with those around us.